All right. Okay, we're now sharing audio on a tape. So there we go. What do you think, Jan? Should we start?
Let's go ahead.
Okay.
Welcome to the third Earth Care Forum. I want to just say a few things about the Zoom presentation. We're going to have Kelly's presentation, and then we'll open it up to questions. Now, those of you that are familiar with Zoom know that on chat, you can write your questions. And if you feel so inclined, why, it would help if you would do that. The other thing I want to ask is, and by the way, I'm Jan Roth, and this is Stan Roth sitting here with me. So the other thing I want to ask is if, while he is presenting, would everybody put on the mute icon?
Almost everybody.
Most have done that so far. Okay, our presentation today, I'll give the exact title here, Medicinal Plant Gardens. Look right here, he's got it in front of us.
Yep.
So Kelly Kindsher, I want Stan to make the introduction. So go ahead, Stan.
I got to know Kelly in the early 1970s after he had completed a stroll across the 400-mile length of our state. He just took up the Santa Fe Trail, hit the Butterfield Trail, and hit the west edge of our
Walking.
Yeah, walking.
Hiking.
I thought I said hike, but he took pictures and was sought after for programs about that hike, and so that's where I got to know him when he gave a program at our one of our Audubon meetings here in town. Got to know him better when I became attached to the Biological Survey in the mid-70s and was doing summer study projects for Ron McGregor and involving my students. And got to know him even better after I was retired in '99 and offered a office over at Biological Survey on West Campus. And I was grateful for that because I set up my office in a way patterned after Kelly, meaning books on every darn shelf, papers sticking out of every file cabinet, papers on top of books and so forth. And that's the way to keep an office. Anyway, Kelly was always available for questions that I had, both myself and my students, high school students, and very polite and cordial and patient every single time. It was almost unnatural for a professor type to do that. So we didn't mind it at all. And this, by the way, is before he had chin whiskers too. So he was just a kid. Anyway, I felt privileged to know Kelly all these years. He was always available, even if his back was to the door, to deal with simple questions that I might have, and good natured about it all, which was, as I say, unusual for a professor type. Anyway, he's still at the Biological Survey, highly regarded by his colleagues that are still there that I know. Boy, they're waning quickly. And but Kelly, our privilege to know you, and take it as a thread. That won't stop. Take care.
Thanks, Stan. And hey, thank you all for joining me. I know quite a few of you, and this is kind of unusual times, and unusual presentation, but I'm going to share with you work I've done in terms of medicinal plants and related to our garden and other gardens. And kind of the big picture here is, I know that at least some of you are interested in setting up a garden, medicinal plant garden at the church. And I want to address that directly as something that I think you can do. And I've actually been out there and looked at the area proposed on the south side of the parking lot, kind of adjacent near the apartments to the south. That would be a great place for a garden. I'm going to suggest some ideas in terms of broadening it. But first, I want to kind of excite you about medicinal plants and opportunities to grow them here and share some of the research that I've done or done with others in all regards. I've been fortunate. Stan mentioned the walk that I did way back when, and in some ways I've just continued on that adventure, learning plants along the way, spending a lot of time across the region. I delight in summer travels, heading out west, western Kansas and the high plains and up into the Rocky Mountains. Seems like kind of a natural thing that goes way back. And in learning about plants and uses of plants in this region, it's obvious that one needs to go to older sources, and those older sources here are the traditional knowledge of Native Americans. About 12 years ago, we had an opportunity to develop a native medicinal plant research program at KU. We got funding from the ill-fated Kansas Bioscience Authority to get started. Barbara Timmerman in medicinal chemistry and myself. I took on the botany part of that work, and she and her lab did the medicinal chemistry, and we screened lots of native Kansas plants, native plants, the Great Plains, but a focus on Kansas for antioxidants, anti-inflammatory properties, wound healing, but especially anti-cancer properties, as that was of great interest and still continues to be of great interest. In doing this work, we traveled all over. I already had lists of plants to look at, but we spent a lot of time collecting wild plants to test, and we also made use of a garden, and I'll talk about the garden here in a minute. Native prairies were a lot of our focus because we're in prairie country, and our prairies are full of biodiversity. At least 220 species have been used medicinally in the prairie region of prairie plants by themselves. About 200 species have been used as food. These are things I've documented and writing about and currently rewriting about. I'm working on a new edition of my Edible Wild Plants to the Prairie book. So I'm expanding the details and information on that as we speak. And of course, you know, we're in a prairie region. There's other grassland regions. We're fortunate here in Kansas with the Flint Hills. We have the largest remaining tract of prairie. You can see the Flint Hills prairie on the left, but our prairie is a little different locally. And of course, lower right, most all of our landscape has become crop fields. So we've had a greatly altered environment, which creates the need to potentially plant prairie plants locally and in gardens, and especially for interpretation and education. So a garden effort that you guys might have, really one of the most important things with that is education. So I've, over the years, created databases of plants. So we have database of over 20,000 entries of plant uses for edible, medicinal, and other cultural uses of our native plants. Make use of that in a variety of projects. And that led to the project we're currently working on. I've delved into lots of historical figures. Melvin Gilmore was a pioneering ethnobotanist, and he did lots of work with Great Plains tribes, including did a lot of work with the Arikara tribe in North Dakota. And with that work, he did a lot of interviews in the 1920s with elders. And Gilmore got sick, got Parkinson's disease in his older age, died in 1942. So I was able the last couple of years to work with some colleagues up on the Arikara Reservation and a couple of Arikara researchers, and we published an Arikara ethnobotany book based on Gilmore's interviews from the 1920s, and have now shared that with elders and youth and others up on the reservation. Gilmore took photos. There's a 1920s photo of how traditional baskets were made using splits of ash and other trees that were good for making baskets for carrying things. In our work, we collected in lots of places, and I love the West. Some are on national grasslands out west, Clark County State Lake. I remember meeting Stan out at St. Jacob's Well in the day with some of his students, high school students, on one of their summer trips. The Black Hills, these are all regional places, rich and full of plants. In working with plants, when asked to identify them, so we spent a lot of time with keys and keying out species to make sure we have the right species, because if you're going to write about a plant, and especially if you're going to do chemistry work, and if you're going to make discoveries, you've got to be accurate in your identification. So for our big project, we collected over 200 species of plants. The chemists wanted a dried kilogram of material, that's 2.2 pounds. Most plants are mostly water, maybe 80% water. So we'd need to collect sometimes up to 20 pounds of plant material and able to get a dried kilogram for the lab. So we spent a lot of time collecting things, but we also needed a garden because some things are really difficult to collect, or we needed to gear up. But whether we grew things or collected them, we made our own voucher specimens so we could say this indeed is what we collected. And we took detailed notes on each species, each collection, because there might be information that would be useful for us later in the analysis or writing things up or needing to return. A lot of us need to return, you need to know where you were. We deliberately collected primarily on state and federal lands. If you collect on private property, which is fine, you have to get permissions. You want to go back, you have to get additional permissions. Sometimes landowners change. So we took advantage of lands that were more available to us. We spent lots of time working with plants, chopping, cutting, because we wanted to dry plants by air. We didn't want to heat them. We didn't want to sun dry them. So we primarily chopped them up and used fans. We enjoyed collecting plants that have big roots, and roots is medicine, like this wild licorice. That's one plant. Easier to get a lot of root pounds or get our dried kilo. Again, we spent a lot of time chopping things up, spreading them out to dry, running fans. But there are a lot of cool plants out there. And I'm just going to share some of the fun ones and suggest some of these for your garden. This plant, Bush Morning Glory, has quite a story. It's one of our morning glories. It's one of the few upright perennial morning glories, which has a medicinal root. I'd previously done work on this. We'd found a compound in it that was anti-TB, against tuberculosis. Has this beautiful flower. It grows in sands throughout the high plains, western Kansas, has this big root. And fortunately in sands, you can dig it and you can go all the way down and grab it and get it out. This is my friend and colleague Quinn Long, who's dug this root. I'd also like to mention there's been a long history of plant exploration in the Great Plains. Here's a 1913 picture of Swiss botanist Karl Schroeder. So there's a long history of this. When we had these big roots like that, we'd bring them back, we'd fill out our clipboard and notes. We had to have material that the chemist could work with. So this is a dried root taken to a bandsaw. This root has annual growth rings, kind of cool. So we could tell the age of these roots, and we had to cut them so we could grind them up. Here's a plant I would suggest both for edible and medicinal uses. This is one we should all know because this is the dough or toe of Topeka. This is a plant that Topeka is named after. Topeka actually means in the Kaw language, a good place to grow groundnuts or good place to grow this plant, which in the Kaw language was to. And this plant was a major food resource for Native Americans going way back when. It's a legume that vines. This is growing up 6 foot tall tomato cages, has these nice flowers in the fall, and has these tuberous roots. These are about as big as golf balls, almost that big, and they're just starchy, they're flavorful, they're good food, they're hardly known. Great educational story on this. They also have medicinal properties, although they were primarily a food and had food use. Plant you probably do know, bee balm. Many of us grow this in our gardens. Major medicinal plant, primarily is a tea, strong tea. This is one of those, if you have a really sore throat, this will cut through that soreness and that gunk in your throat and make it easier to breathe and swallow. Very aromatic, also used as a perfume plant. Some plants are fun. This is a plant of wetlands. It's called boneset. Well, you'd think the common name would tell you what it's used for, but it's got a twist. This plant's claim to fame has long been against colds and fevers and illness, and it was a major remedy used against the 1918 flu pandemic. And that flu, like other flus we had, made people's bones ache. You know, that achy feeling you get when you get the flu sometimes. This flu pandemic, people really ached. And this plant was used and it relieved that achiness. In fact, it even helped with the flu. We know that there are immune stimulants in this plant. And there's data that shows that immune stimulants do help us alleviate symptoms or reduce the incidence of some illnesses. So this plant was used to help against the bone break fever of that wonderful and difficult and traumatic pandemic that people had in the 19-teens. Lobelia syphilitica. Yes, it was used against syphilis, but not very effective. This plant grows again in wet seeps, wetland areas. Really pretty plant. Those flowers are almost an inch long. This is our pickup truck coming back from a collecting trip. After we would collect lots of these plants, as I said, we had to lay them out to dry, spent lots of time drying. And then eventually, here's student Greg, who was grinding plants. That's our grinder. That was the thing that had to have the ground up roots so we could get the roots through this grinder. We had to make sure in doing this work that we clean the grinder between each different species, because if you have any material that's there, it could get in the next batch. And it is surprising, most of our plants have sticky compounds, have stickiness in them, little residue that we had to make sure we got cleaned out. So after we did our work, we took these kilo bags of material to the medicinal chemistry lab, and Dr. Timmerman and her folks would do the chemistry work on these. And coming forward, our big success was that this plant, the wild tomatillo, was found to have more antioxidants than any other species that collected. And specifically had a lot more than oranges or things that we think of with having vitamin C in those things. In fact, there's a relationship between antioxidants and anti-cancer. So we took some of the dried material from this plant. The medical center ran screens and quickly discovered that it was pretty potent in its anti-cancer activity. We did more work on this plant. The plant is poisonous. It's a member of the tomato, potato family. The foliage, like tomatoes or potatoes, is poisonous, but this plant has fruits that are edible, much like tomatoes and peppers. And even the fruits had compounds. We had new discoveries for science, new compounds in these plants that had antioxidant activity, anti-cancer activity, and we were pretty excited about it, but the anti-cancer activity, even though it reduced tumor size in rats and appeared to be effective against breast cancer, did not persist. The activity had a temporary effect on reducing tumors, but didn't persist. A fun story with this plant, though, is that it was a major food source. The dried fruits are really tasty. I mean, they taste something like dried cranberries or dried tomatoes. They're really rather sweet. And there's a long human history. The green is it occurs in all these states. The red dots are some of the archaeological sites where the seeds have been found, and the numbers relate to tribes that used it as food. Long history of food. You know, we think about traditional diets. One of the advantages of traditional diets is people ate a lot more foods that were healthy than we eat today. They ate a lot of wild foods that had high contents of antioxidant properties, anti-cancer properties. We now know with the push towards all of us eating more fruits and vegetables that it's a good thing to eat things that reflect a wider array of chemical properties. Of course, my favorite plant, one I've written about, in fact, I've written the book on Echinacea. I published a book on Echinacea, chemistry, wild harvest, Native American uses. The Springer published a few years ago. We've been able to document 16 different tribes that used Echinacea. It was pretty much a cure-all. It was used from everything from snake bite to flus and colds to just general debility. This plant, there's several species. We have 2 species locally, Echinacea Palada and Echinacea atrorubens. Echinacea angustifolia is found in the Flint Hills and further west. Big range for this Great Plains plant. And then sadly, it's much more used as a medicine in Europe, only native to the US. Australia and Europe, there's much more research on it. It is effective against upper respiratory tract infections. And it does help against even the common cold. Don't get controversial here, but it could have helped a little bit against COVID. I'm not saying it would cure COVID, but it might have really diminished some of the longer term symptoms because it again possesses immune stimulating properties. It has more than one compound that stimulates the immune system. One's in the liquid extract, carbohydrate extract. And if you remove all that from the plant, there's still another compound at least that also has immune stimulating effects. This is Cedar Bluff Reservoir out in western Kansas. Here's Echinacea Palada. This is our local species. It's beautiful, wonderful in gardens, tall, graceful flowers. Long history of harvesting Echinacea in Kansas, actually from Oklahoma. But Kansas has supplied tremendous amounts of Echinacea to the market over decades. We wrote a paper on the 120-year harvest history of Kansas residents harvesting the medicinal plant and selling it to the drug trade industry. We are concerned about overharvest, but in data that we published, we've shown that the majority of plants that were harvested actually resprout. This plant has a remarkable ability to sprout after the top 6 to 8 inches of the root has been harvested. We went out with harvesters and figured out how they worked, and they showed us where they harvested. We went back to those places and saw that plants did come back. We actually dug up a tremendous number of plants and actually saw root resprouts on half of the plants in harvest locations, both in western Kansas, north of Hayes, and in Montana. We worked out near Miles City, Montana one summer. And again, there's published research, clinical trials that show that taking Echinacea before long trips, like to Australia, where you're sitting in a plane next to someone that's hacking and coughing the whole trip, you'll be less likely to get that upper respiratory tract infection if you consume Echinacea as a tincture before, during, and after that trip. Okay, so I want to talk about gardening too. So a big piece of our work was we needed to have a garden. We needed to grow more of those wild tomatillos. There were plants it was easier for us to cultivate. So we created this garden in 2008. Some of you may have been there. It's just north of town near the airport. And you're welcome to go out and visit it. It's open. You can even go out there today. Although I wouldn't recommend that. Things are a little covered with snow. We also were involved in a garden that's actually not too far from your church, the School of Pharmacy there on West Campus in 2011. Dr. Timmer and I got permission to help install a garden adjacent to the food court for pharmacy students. A little bit subversive on my part, educate them about herbal plants while they're learning about pharmacy because it's their history. We did this work in part too because there's a long history of having a pharmacy garden. On the lower left, and I'll show a couple more pictures, is the original drug garden, as it was called at KU in the 1940s. That garden was located approximately where Robinson Gymnasium is, nearish to Allen Fieldhouse. At the pharmacy garden, we've labeled plants. So one of the things I would recommend to you is to think about labeling and education. So we made an effort to label these plants so that students could learn about them and learn when they were in the National Formulary and US Pharmacopoeia. You can go see these signs at the School of Pharmacy Garden. They're out with plant materials. A couple pictures from that original drug garden is kind of fun to see. We got the list of plants, and there's foxglove and wormwood and a bunch of things. There's a second picture. And I'd like to point out that here in the back were two plants we didn't include in our garden. At that point in time, cannabis was considered a worthy research topic. There also are opium poppies in the garden. We've not grown either of those at our School of Pharmacy garden because they're now illegal. And of course, they might disappear in the middle of the night. It's kind of a sad note. We still really can't easily do research on cannabis at KU or nationally. NIH really won't fund it. You can get special permission for research, but in terms of applications of grants that would study cannabis, our federal government is still really not open or willing to see that research. And I don't believe that cannabis is the end all or the healer, but there's good compounds in it. We should be studying it. Also been involved in the last couple of years, a little garden you might want to look at. This is near the Brommelstick house, adjacent to Hobbs Park, calls the Hobbs Park Garden. Caitlin Stanley headed this up. She got funding from the East 9th project, and this garden is just essentially put in as a neighborhood garden. And we've put in, it's a medicinal plant garden. I can see butterfly milkweed up front. There's asters, whole variety of plants. Again, we had signage. Many plants are both edible and medicinal. Most people don't realize that the common milkweed, wonderful pollinator plant, also is still a major food for the Potawatomi, Winnebago, Omaha, who still, tribal members still like to make soup out of those plants in the spring, every spring. They use the young tender leaves or young flower buds or young pods. But signage is an important thing to think about. Signs don't have to be expensive. These are just pieces of wood, and someone who's much better than me able to make and write the signage. We also put in a little food garden there, and I would recommend you consider this too. It's just fun to have some food things. This is for neighbors, planted for neighbors. Things got picked. People got interested in this. Greens, you had chard, carrots, arugula. Here in this picture, there are also some tomatoes. Okay, focusing more on garden themes. Even if you're wanting to do a medicinal plant garden, an important thing right now are pollinator plants. And that fits in with any garden. So here's Penstemon, Digitalis, the big bumblebee. As many of you know, some plants are better than others for pollinators, but something to keep in mind as an added attribute in any garden you do. It's kind of surprising and wonderful, but I never thought that pollinator species might be a major drive of conservation. We're now protecting prairies because of pollinators. Monarch butterflies, regal fritillaries, other butterflies are driving that interest, and people love to see them. And you can pull them into the garden right there at the church. Another theme, and these themes relate to things that we've been involved in. We now have a dye garden out at our medicinal plant garden. Marianne Jordan, who's teaches the fiber classes at KU, faculty member, worked with us to set this garden up. We got a little bit of funding from Elizabeth Schultz, or she did, but with our help this past year to set up this garden, and there'll be some workshops on dye plants. Again, there's an overlap. Many medicinal plants also have dye characteristics in them too. It is easy to get dyes and colors out of plants, but some colors are much harder than others. It's hard to get the royal colors, the deep blues and reds. Those were royal colors in Europe because they were hard to come by. And for the elites, yellows, greens, tans, browns are much, much easier. Students, we've always had great pleasure in involving students. And I've taken great pleasure in mentoring students, and Hannah's been one of my favorite students who's now entering grad school, doing GIS work and work on trees and forests at the University of Washington. Bon's a more recent student who's kind of doing a year off, but also headed to grad school. Plants for the garden. What does one plant? How do you get those plants? Well, we do a variety of things. We grow some things in our greenhouse. I even grow some things at home. In this case, we were planting a bed of Echinacea. These we purchased just because it was cheap and easy to purchase a lot of Echinacea purpurea. And then in some cases, I've actually collected things from the wild. One needs to be thinking about conservation and not just taking things, but there are many plants that you can move into a garden. And then the last is I move plants from home, or I have other friends, or maybe even some of you who grow things. It's like, oh, can I get some of that? You know, there's always that sharing of plants and plant materials. Soil preparation. We've also had great opportunity at the Medicinal Plant Garden. We've had Douglas County Master Gardeners work with us. Some of you know may know Sharon Ashworth. She's been in charge of that program. Roxy McGee has been one of the key people who's helped us over the years. She's in the center of that picture. In this case, there was a group of master gardeners that wanted to do a little prairie restoration at our garden, and we're involved here in some soil prep, in this case for planting grasses and wildflowers. So a little different prep than you might do. And I'll say more about that in just a minute. But I guess I would say this, the garden area that you currently are looking at is lawn. It's a great place to convert it into a garden site. It would not be real difficult. I asked and was told that there hadn't been recent herbicide use. I would be concerned if there was, only because that would carry over and might kill broadleaf plants this next spring. But that area could be tilled up. And if you're going to garden there, ideally, I'd say till it as soon as you can, and then till it again. But it's nice to get things tilled while the ground still freezes and thaws. That helps kill the grass. It's mostly fescue in that spot. I didn't see a lot of perennial weeds that would persist. So it's a great place to get tilled and have as a garden site. Our medicinal plant garden, of course, I'm talking about all these things that's attracted. We had great interest in doing a student garden. Jason Herring and Katrina McClure were two people that helped initiate this garden. And they got the garden off to a great start. And then after their leadership ended, it kind of bounced around for a little bit. And then with the COVID pandemic, all of a sudden, it just boomed again. We were getting international students, we were getting other students. We had great gardens out there this past year. And they did something that you might consider. They put in a lot of permanent beds. So I do like this idea. I like the idea of planting in beds. We do that too. But in this case, they actually made wooden structures and filled them with a little better soil. Making raised beds is a good thing. It's nice if people don't step in the gardens, but or work around them, reach in them rather than stand in them. Really helps in productivity. As you can see from these peppers, and they've just picked some onions, and you can see the tomato vines and other peppers in back. It's really a great way to grow things. Resources. This is meant to be humorous, but mulch is a great thing. And sometimes we've had people just help us get resources. So we got someone to drop us off a big round bale. Well, those big round bales are wrapped up in plastic, and we had to cut all that off. We had plastic to get rid of for a while. And then it's hard to take one of those big bales apart. They're packed in so tight, it's much easier to work with small bales. But we've had a great history of getting things donated. Old spent hay gets brought in. We also work with a tree trimmer who brings us in wood mulch. Those tree trimmers are grinding up material. They like to sell it, but at times they get too much. And so we've become a place where they could dump a load occasionally. And if you have a spot that's out of the way, that works well. You do need to work with them. You do not want to get thorny honey locust or Osage orange, that's got thorns, because then when you handle it, it's thorny. But resources are real important. It's nice to get compost. It's nice to get material that helps the soil. In terms of a native plant focus for a garden, though, you don't want a lot of nutrients. Our plants thrive in competition. And if you have too much good soil, a lot of our prairie plants, native plants, will grow up tall and fall over. It's just too rich, it's too good. They're used to competing against things, so you don't need really great soil. So if you took that garden area and tilled it up, I would not encourage fertilizing it initially. I would come in and spot fertilize. If you see plants that are not green or not doing well and you think it's nutrients, I would fertilize a little bit. I'm going to kind of wrap up here and take some questions, but I did want to say, I think a key for the garden is having sufficient interest by the group and making things scalable. Start out small, figure out who's going to work, who's not going to work, who's going to do weeding. And kind of the big question is, who's going to help take care of the garden in August when no one wants to be out in this terrible Kansas climate? Who's going to water a few things? Who's going to take care of stuff? Who's going to have interest to carry this on? It is easy to have lots of excitement in the spring. I see this with the student gardens all the time. We get tremendous interest in the spring. Students say, oh, I'll be around this summer. Many of them leave. Most of them leave. And then who's going to take care of the garden? It gets weedy. I'm okay with that. It's a learning experience. For our gardens, it's not like these are show gardens. It's okay to have some weeds, but someone needs to be able to take care and do that. So ultimately, you need to focus on your goals for the garden. What are your interests? What are the group's interests? How is this a community thing? How does it involve other people? How can this be helpful? One thing I thought of looking at the location, if you had a garden that also had a small space that you're growing greens and other food, I'll bet there's people from those apartments that would take interest in that and help and want to harvest some greens or tomatoes or other food. So you could reach out even to the community right around you rather easily. So we typically do tours at the garden, but we've kind of quit doing that with COVID, but we will do them again. Our gardens are on my website, and I'll pull up the web link next. But you are welcome to go out there, any and all of you. This map is on the website for our medicinal plant garden. We are proud to say that it is open at all times, dawn to dark. The gate's open. We've propped it open during COVID, so you wouldn't even have to touch the handle. The School of Pharmacy garden is just out in the open. You can see the signage there. You can go over at any time. I know parking's hard at KU, so go when classes are not happening in session or evening, you won't get ticketed. And then the other garden I mentioned over by Hobbs ball field, that's also open or available. So we have more information on the website about work we've done. Please look at our website, and you can go there, and under our program and about us, you can find maps to our gardens and learn more about them. So let me stop there, and I really feel a valuable thing here to do is to get your questions and get some feedback. So you're welcome just to ask a question or put something in chat. And if there's some things in chat, I didn't see them. Jan, maybe you can help with that. So thank you.
Okay, Kelly, thanks so much. I mean, this is a lot here. We do have some chats, questions. Margie has said that this garden that you're looking at, that you've been showing us, I think was a medicinal garden. Is that right?
Yes.
Margie?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I'm part of the master gardener group that works on that medicinal garden, the master gardener part. So the picture that you were talking about, Roxy,
yes,
is that when we were working at preparing the ground for planting that prairie 3 years ago, we did that in 20. Yeah. 19 and 20. So that's, and I'm on the committee that's planning the planting there on the ground at the church. And so we're hoping to use some of that same process. And Sharon Ashworth has talked with the group too. So
Yes.
this is very timely for you to speak for us.
Good. I'm excited about that planting at the Medicinal Plant Garden. I know it's not maybe gone as some people would expect, but it's working. And, you know, with all of our gardens, there's always delights and minor failures, but overall, I'm really pleased to see that. That's been great.
Linda Watts has a question. She says, what is a good source of native seeds other than from friends and neighbors?
So your best source of native seeds is something locally collected. If you can, you want local material. It just does best. That's the best thing for our pollinators. I don't know if any of you read the New York Times, but I was interviewed a few weeks ago by the New York Times about echinacea, and purchased seeds, often purchased cultivars. We now call those nativars. Thinking about sunflowers and echinacea for a minute. Some of the newest cultivars no longer have disc flowers. They've converted everything into petals. So you may have flowers, purchase them that are varieties that have petals instead of disc flowers, and things like many of our butterflies and bees, disc flowers, which are the center little flowers, like on a zinnia, those little yellow, tiny yellow flowers in the middle, that's what the pollinators want. Whereas what we think of as the petals are ray flowers, and they're sterile. So those big on sunflowers, zinnias, cosmos, those petals are actually sterile. The pollinators want those center ones. So wild types are better. If you can't collect, there are some sources of seed, but there's not a lot of native seeds available. There are some folks growing them locally, not a lot. Patty Ragsdale has a little company. She's been growing some plants. Some of you may know the Grassland Heritage Foundation does a plant sale. Many of them get plants from Missouri, which is okay. There's Missouri Wildflower Nursery in Jeff City that grows lots of plants. We're truly lacking though in local germplasm. So it is an issue, and it's okay to buy things from further afield. I'm just saying that ideally one wants to get local as much as possible.
Any other?
I
Go
just
ahead.
have a question from Jane. Hi, Jane, about the wild tomatillos and why didn't the benefits persist? You know, on the wild tomatillos in terms of their anti-cancer, you know, we don't know entirely. And there was interest in doing more tweaks. The pharmaceutical chemists tweak the molecules. Some are more water soluble. Some of them would be more assimilated. And then we never got more funding. So there's things that weren't done that we would have liked to have done. And it's really hard to get plants into the pharmaceutical arena. They're much more interested in things that you've discovered and tweaked and published and provided safety and efficacy data. That's how far things need to go these days. So I don't have an answer to that question fully. Okay, whoever else out there, please ask questions or comment. Many of you are as knowledgeable as me on these garden things too, so please comment.
Diane Waddell has a question.
My book, yes. Well, I'm delayed my contract, so I'm not going to submit the draft to the University Press until the end of the year. But I would expect that my new edition of Wild Edible Plants will be out sometime in 2023. And I am also will immediately begin work on redoing the medicinal wild plants. In both cases, the press approached me about doing this. My first response is, you know, I still feel pretty good about that work. That was good work. And I'm now doing other things. And then it dawned on me, I have more to say. And I have found out more. And there's more plants that were used. So now I'm delving into it deeply and enjoying it mostly. Writing's always hard, painful at times, but I enjoy it overall. So I'd say it's going to be at least a year before the edible plant book is out, and probably 2 to 3 years before my new edition of medicinal plants are out. But thanks for asking.
I just wanted to say, I have relatives from Western Kansas, and they always talked about medicinal. They were herbal based. Blackberry balsam was one that would always make you well. Castor oil was ingested.
Yes.
And those things are native, and perhaps it would be good to look at our written history, you know, like interviews with people out there, and they'll refer to plants that they knew that they could use for health.
Yeah, and you know, I agree with that. It'd be great to do that. And I'm not opposed to non-native plants. There's a lot of history of non-native plants being used and are interesting and educational. A couple other veins here. You know, I really think there should be medicinal plant gardens around for people to use to make simple teas, simple remedies. There's very few herbal plants that are truly poisonous. You need to be educated, but we could sure help ourselves improve our general health by consuming more herbal products. So a garden could be a harvest place. There's lots of overlap, especially in European herbals, with culinary plants. If you think about it, culinary sage, thyme, oregano, all of those are strong antioxidants, are strong medicinal plants, and taste great in our food. And there's great health benefits from them. So an herbal garden really can also in part be culinary garden. And we want to encourage people to use things. I'm very keen on this. Yes, we need to educate about safety, but we know so much. I mean, if I invited you over for dinner and I told you I was going to cook up a mess of tomato greens, you probably go, I don't think we should eat tomato greens. And they are poisonous. I mean, we eat poisonous plants all the time. We just know that you eat the fruits of tomatoes. You don't eat the foliage. How do we know that? Well, we grew up learning these things. And we can study. We have the internet available. I am not overly worried about people getting hurt. I mean, got to be sensible, got to look at things, you know, work with people. But for simple health things, why not try an herbal product? If it works or helps, great. And if you still have problems or have other problems, yes, we have doctors and medical establishment, and they're not totally opposed to herbal things either. They just don't study it. That's not their work. That's not their training. They're not trained in nutrition either. You know, so they don't usually talk a lot about these things, but I encourage it.
Kelly, one of the things I noticed in your presentation, you have a good source of labor, students, master gardeners. I think at our particular situation, we have, we're needing people to help with this. Any ideas? Labor.
Yes,
I mean, a number of us are in our
Geriatric.
yes. Well,
so
I think these are all about relationship building. And I think there is student help available for you too. For instance, I do teach and work in the environmental studies program. I'm always looking for projects for students. So your garden could be a student project. The problem with students, of course, is that some are really good, and I've mentioned some of the really good students, and other students just aren't as interested, and all of them need training and advice. And it's a great way to have working relationships, but student labor by itself is not always as helpful as we'd like and takes quite a bit of time. but you know, there's a variety of ways of engaging people. And I think when one starts and you start attracting people or interest, they can become helpers. You kind of need to build on that. And one thing is I'd say is, you know, seniors have lots of knowledge and information to share. And if you're open to doing that, there are young folks that want to gain from that, want to learn from that. So be open to those relationships. And I think you can help foster those things. I would mention, kind of relates to the issue of labor and help and also resources. It does help to have a little bit of funding. There's just things to buy for the group, or if you're making beds, you know, ideally having a tool shed that's locked probably with tools there for some hose and shovels, and a water supply. Need to pay for water. Not a big expense, but a little bit of funding, you know, really helps.
Can you see the questions? There are a number of them here now.
Okay, I did. Now let me go up the top. I'm lost in the morass. So there we go. Okay, where are we at? Okay. Yeah, so the other plants to recommend. I probably could come up with a list for you, if you would like, of 10 or 20 or 50 if you wanted, of plants that would be great to grow. Some easier, some hard. You should do both. You definitely want to have things that are successful. Obviously, some plants are just easy to grow. Some are really hard. I can't grow some plants. The ground nut, yes, is Apios americana, or dough, as in Topeka. And I'm growing keen on trying to use some native names in terms of common names. That's why I talk about wild tomatillos, which are known as ground cherries. I'm trying to think what I want to use for Apios, because no one knows it as ground nuts, and ground nuts are another name for peanuts in other parts of the world. Tio or dough doesn't quite work for folks. Hopness is the name that's been used. But it's really hard to talk about plants sometimes because common names are confusing. Books that teach on how to make medicines. Yes, I like Richa Check's books. I also really fond of Rosemary Gladstar. She has some really nice books on making medicines. There's
all that in mind.
There's someone who's wrote a really good book, Dara Seville, who's out in Albuquerque, just wrote a book on herbal medicine from an ecological perspective, and that really the importance of herbal medicine is engaging us in the plants, engaging us in the work, engaging us in nature, and that in and of itself is healing and helpful. And I think particularly in these times, I think part of the interest in all of us in gardening is it is good for us. It's mental helpful. It's provides us sustenance, provides us very good things. So I want to encourage those, but there's many other good books. Okay, Permaculture Program. Yes, there's a permaculture class at KU, the Environmental Studies Program. Sadly, we don't do enough for students in terms of their interest in gardening and farming. We have lots of students who are suburban, let's say Johnson County, come to KU, and they want to learn how to farm. They want to learn how to grow food. We don't do that very well. And I don't encourage them to go to K-State for that, because if you go to K-State and go to horticulture, you're not going to learn permaculture. You're going to learn, you know, a variety of things that which be useful. But many of these students really are interested in these topics because of climate change, because of changes coming upon us. It's not that they truly want to become farmers and classic farmers. They're looking for niches for themselves. They're looking to be more self-reliant, self-sufficient for dealing with climate change. It's a big challenge to educate these students in ways that's both helpful to them and their interests and helpful to them related to the future. So we don't have as many resources in that vein at KU as I'd like, but I'm thinking about it. Okay, what else here? Oh, Dara Seville, someone spelled that right. Yes.
Annie Stevens, yeah.
Yeah. It's a University Press book, which I reviewed for them.
All right. Are there any other questions?
One thing I thought about, someone asked you about seeds and seed sources. As of a couple weeks ago, there's still going to be the traditional annual seed fair. If COVID abates a little bit, but we've had this wonderful event at the fairgrounds in February most years. So it's a great thing to go to if it occurs. We'll have to see, but a lot of people bring seeds to that event, including native seeds. So if that does happen, a really, really fun event to go to. And, for those of us who garden, it's, prime thinking about gardening time. So it's pretty exciting. Yes, K-State has a permaculture class, and there are good people and good work at K-State. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm bashing K-State. I don't do that. Including our Master Gardeners program really is a K-State program, which is great.
Well, Kelly, I tell you, you are a master. You have so much knowledge, and I understand what it's like to write it, but boy, you will age. There will be a day. So get as much written as you can.
Yes,
because
I'm focused on that. Yes.
Because we all really appreciate you and want to thank you for being here with us today.
Well, I'm glad to join you and want to you and let me know of your plans. And I would be glad to loop in. So please do something. Start small. Why not?
Start small. That was the intention here.
Yep. Yeah.
I want to say one thing, Kelly. One of the overall reasons for some of our sessions being on the garden is to try to help people convert their yards out of things. And it's a long process and need to be patient. I also want to let people know, I put my email, I believe, in here. Yeah, the rest of the presentations will all be on Zoom, and we'll send out the link for both next week, which is on the solar farm, and then Karen Ashworth is going to be doing one in the last session, which will be again a compliment of what you said. So thank you so much for what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you all, and enjoy your weekend. And I look forward to the greening of spring.
Thank you to all. Thank you to all of you for coming. We really appreciate having a response to our programs. And thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. Take care, all. Bye.
Okay.
That went well.
What happened?
Oh, there's Tom and McGee.